Mark sat in the corner of his bedroom at 4:20 a.m., his back pressed against the wall and a loaded syringe trembling in his hands. The needle caught the light from his desk lamp, gleaming like a silver fong in the semi-darkness. He'd already shot up 3 times tonight, first heroin, then cocaine, then a cocktail of whatever pills he'd managed to steal from his father's medicine cabinet. His pulse hammered against his throat, and his vision swam with chemical distortions that made the shadows dance at the edges of his sight. But he was still awake. Still conscious. Still alive. That was all that mattered now. The past week had been a nightmare of loss and escalating terror. Tommy, Sarah, Billy, Jenny, all of them gone. The official causes varied: heart attack, brain aneurysm, respiratory failure, cardiac arrest, but Mark knew the truth. They'd all been murdered by that horrific thing. Mark could feel the thing's attention focusing on them with predatory intensity. It was done playing with large groups, done with elaborate psychological games. Now it wanted to finish what it had started. Mark raised the syringe to his arm, searching for a vein that hadn't already collapsed from his week-long chemical assault. His arms formed constellations of self-destruction across his pale skin. The heroin would put him under, he knew that. But the cocaine might keep him in a twilight state between consciousness and sleep, a chemical limbo where dreams couldn't fully take hold. It was dangerous. Mixing uppers and downers in these quantities was basically suicide, but death by overdose seemed preferable to whatever the burn thing had planned for him. His hands shook so violently that he nearly dropped the needle. Withdrawal symptoms were setting in despite his constant drug use, his body's chemistry so disrupted that even massive doses weren't enough to maintain equilibrium. His skin crawled with phantom insects, his muscles cramped with painful spasms, and his mind raced with paranoid thoughts that might or might not be drug-induced. Through the thin walls of the apartment, he could hear his father snoring in the next bedroom, deep, rhythmic sounds that spoke of natural, peaceful sleep. Robert Stevens had retreated into alcohol after his wife's death, drinking himself into oblivion every night to escape the grief that Mark faced with pharmaceutical assistance. But his father's demons were natural, human, manageable. Mark was dealing with something far worse. The syringe found a usable vein in his left forearm, and Mark pushed the plunger with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to mainline drugs with medical precision. The heroin hit his bloodstream, spreading through his system with numbing warmth that temporarily silenced his overstimulated nerves. For a moment, Mark felt almost peaceful. The drugs created a chemical barrier between him and reality, a fortress that might be enough to keep the nightmare at bay for another few hours. But even as the heroin dulled his pain, his mind remained hyperalert from the cocaine and amphetamines he'd consumed earlier. The combination created a surreal state of consciousness, his body floating in narcotic bliss while his thoughts raced with manic intensity. 4:37 a.m. Mark's head lolled back against the wall, his eyes half closed but still aware of his surroundings. The room seemed to breathe around him, walls expanding and contracting with the rhythm of his chemically altered heartbeat. The ceiling tiles shifted and rearranged themselves into patterns that almost spelled out words he couldn't quite read. He'd been awake for 6 days straight, sustained by an ever-increasing cocktail of stimulants that had pushed his cardiovascular system well beyond safe limits. His heart felt like it was trying to burst from his chest, and his blood pressure spiked and crashed with each new chemical he introduced to his system. But consciousness meant survival, and survival was the only goal that mattered anymore. The photograph on his nightstand caught his attention, Mark and his mother at last year's Christmas dinner, both of them smiling despite the shadow of her illness already beginning to show in her gaunt features. Rebecca Stevens had been beautiful once, before the cancer ate her alive from the inside. In the picture, she was trying to maintain that beauty for his sake, wearing makeup to hide the gray pallor that chemotherapy had given her skin. "I'm sorry, Mom," Mark whispered to the photograph, his voice slurred by the heroin coursing through his veins. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I'm sorry I'm such a fuck-up." The image seemed to shift in response, his mother's smile fading to an expression of profound disappointment. Mark blinked hard, trying to clear his vision, but when he looked again, the photograph remained unchanged, just a piece of paper capturing a moment that felt like it belonged to someone else's life. His phone buzzed with a text message, the sound abnormally loud in the chemical-enhanced silence of his bedroom. The caller ID showed Lisa's name, and Mark fumbled to answer with fingers that felt like they belonged to someone else. "Mark? Are you okay? You sound weird." Lisa's voice carried the hollow quality of someone who'd been crying for hours. She was the only other survivor, the only person left who understood what they were facing. "I'm fine," Mark lied, his words running together like melted wax. "Just medicating. Staying awake." "This isn't working," Lisa said, and Mark could hear the despair in her voice. "The drugs, the staying awake, were just prolonging the inevitable. Maybe we should." "Should what?" Mark interrupted, his paranoia spiking. "Give up? Let that thing win? Maybe we should accept that this is bigger than us. That we can't fight something like this." Mark wanted to argue, but the heroin was making him philosophical, turning his thoughts inward toward dark contemplations of mortality and meaning. Maybe Lisa was right. Maybe they were just delaying the inevitable, torturing themselves with false hope when the outcome had already been determined. "I keep thinking about my mom," he said, his voice barely audible. "About how she suffered at the end. All those machines, all those tubes, she begged me to let her go, but I couldn't. I made her hang on because I was too selfish to say goodbye. Mark. She died hating me," he continued, the words spilling out like blood from a wound. "I could see it in her eyes. All that pain, all that suffering, and it was my fault for not being strong enough to let her go peacefully." Lisa was crying now, her sobs carrying through the phone with heartbreaking clarity. "It's not your fault. The cancer killed her, not you." But Mark wasn't listening anymore. The drugs were pulling him deeper into chemically induced introspection, forcing him to confront the guilt and self-hatred he'd been numbing for months. Every needle, every pill, every desperate attempt to escape consciousness, it was all because he couldn't live with what he'd done to his mother. Or what he'd failed to do. 4:52 a.m. Mark's eyes began to drift closed despite his chemical arsenal. The heroin was winning the battle against the stimulants, dragging him toward the unconsciousness he'd been fighting so desperately to avoid. His grip on the phone loosened, and it clattered to the floor, cutting off Lisa's voice mid-sentence. The transition into sleep was gradual, like sinking into warm water that got deeper with each breath. Mark's last coherent thought was a prayer to whatever deity might be listening. "Please let me die from the overdose before the dreams begin." But his body was stronger than he'd hoped, conditioned by months of drug abuse to process massive quantities of narcotics without shutting down completely. Instead of dying, he slipped into the nightmare realm where his tormentor waited with infinite patience and carefully crafted horrors. Mark found himself standing in the intensive care unit of Springwood General Hospital, surrounded by the familiar sounds and smells of medical equipment and antiseptic. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with the same frequency that had driven him crazy during his mother's final weeks, and the air carried the distinctive scent of industrial disinfectant mixed with human suffering. But this wasn't quite the ICU he remembered. The walls seemed too tall, the ceiling too low, creating a claustrophobic space that pressed in from all sides. The heart monitors beeped in rhythms that were almost but not quite human, and the 4 stands held bags filled with fluids that definitely weren't saline. In the center of the room, his mother lay on the same hospital bed where she'd died 3 months ago. Rebecca Stevens looked exactly as she had in her final days, skeletal thin, her skin gray and papery, her once beautiful hair reduced to sparse wisps that barely covered her scalp. But she was conscious, her eyes open and aware, staring at Mark with an expression that mixed love and accusation in equal measure. "Hello, Marky," she said, her voice carrying the raspy quality of someone whose lungs had been ravaged by disease and chemotherapy. "I've been waiting for you." Mark tried to move toward her, but his feet seemed rooted to the hospital floor. He could only stand and watch as machines surrounded her bed began to malfunction, their displays showing impossible readings and their alarms creating a cacophony of electronic distress. "Mom?" Mark's voice came out as a whisper. "Are you okay?" Rebecca smiled, but it was the same sad expression she'd worn during her final weeks, the look of someone who understood that her child was about to watch her suffer in ways no human being should have to endure. "I'm dying, sweetheart," she said matter-of-factly. "Again. Just like before, except this time you get to watch it happen over and over until you understand what you did to me." Before Mark could respond, Rebecca's body began to convulse on the bed, her back arching as invisible agony tore through her system. The cancer was consuming her in fast forward, eating through her organs with visible hunger. Mark could see the tumors growing beneath her skin, dark masses that pulsed with their own malevolent life. "Please," Mark begged, trying to move forward to help her, but his body remained paralyzed. "Let me call the doctor. Let me do something." "You had your chance to do something," Rebecca replied, even as blood began to pour from her mouth. "You had months to let me go peacefully, but you were too selfish. Too weak. Too afraid of being alone." Her body began to dissolve from the inside out, organs liquefying and pouring out through her pores in streams of dark fluid. But even as her physical form disintegrated, she continued to speak, her voice growing more accusatory with each word. "I begged you, Mark. I begged you to let me die with dignity. But you couldn't handle it. You made me suffer because you couldn't cope with your own grief." The dissolution completed itself, leaving nothing but empty bed sheets soaked with blood and other fluids. Mark stood paralyzed in horror, but before he could process what he'd witnessed, his mother's body began to reform on the bed, knitting itself back together from the puddle of biological matter. "Again," she said as her face reconstructed itself from liquefied tissue. "Watch me die again, Marky. This time from the infections you let them give me because you wouldn't sign the DNR. This death was different, slower, more agonizing." Mark watched his mother's body consume itself from within as opportunistic infections ravaged her immune-compromised system. Her skin turned black with necrosis, her organs shut down one by one, and through it all she stared at him with eyes that burned with justified accusation. "You did this to me," she whispered as pus and blood flowed from every orifice. "Your selfishness. Your weakness. Your inability to let go." Mark wanted to scream, wanted to run, wanted to tear his eyes out rather than witness his mother's suffering. But he remained frozen in place, forced to watch as she died in the most horrible way imaginable while blaming him for every moment of pain. As her body finished its second dissolution, Mark heard familiar laughter echoing through the ICU. The burned thing stepped out from behind one of the machines, wearing a doctor's white coat over its charred sweater. The stethoscope around its neck was made of human vertebrae, and the medical chart in its clawed hands appeared to be written in blood. "Fascinating case," the creature said with clinical detachment. "Chronic guilt syndrome complicated by substance abuse and mother-related trauma. Textbook example of unresolved grief manifesting as self-destructive behavior." Rebecca began to reform again, but this time the process was slower, more deliberate. Mark could see every organ as it materialized, every blood vessel as it connected, every nerve as it wove itself into the growing network of her nervous system. The patient's son, the burned thing, continued, consulting its bloody chart, prolonged her suffering through emotional manipulation and selfish attachment. Classic case of caregiver pathology, putting his own needs above those of the dying patient. "That's not true," Mark tried to say, but no sound came from his throat. "Oh, but it is true," the creature replied with obvious satisfaction. "You knew she was in pain. You knew the treatments weren't working. You knew she wanted to die peacefully. But you couldn't let her go because that would mean facing your own mortality, your own abandonment issues." Rebecca's reformation completed, and she looked at Mark with eyes that held nothing but disappointment and pain. "Third time's the charm," she said weakly. "This time you get to watch me die from the overdose you're going to give yourself tonight." Mark realized with growing horror that his arms were beginning to ache, a deep, throbbing pain that started in his bones and worked outward. He looked down and saw that his veins were becoming visible through his skin, dark lines that pulsed with each heartbeat. "What's happening to me?" he whispered. "Circulatory cascade failure," the burn doctor explained cheerfully. "Very rare condition. The blood vessels become overpressurized and begin to rupture in sequence. Quite beautiful, actually, like flowers blooming under the skin." Mark's left arm exploded first. The vein in his forearm burst open, spraying blood in arterial patterns across the hospital room. But instead of pain, Mark felt a strange sense of relief, as if pressure that had been building for months was finally being released. More veins began to rupture, in his right arm, his legs, his torso. Each explosion sent gouts of blood streaming through the air, creating abstract patterns on the white walls of the ICU. Mark's life force painted the room in crimson arcs that would have been beautiful if they weren't coming from his own body. The circulatory system is remarkably artistic when it fails catastrophically, the creature observed, taking notes on its blood-stain chart. Notice how the spray patterns create almost mandala-like designs. Very aesthetic. Rebecca watched her son's blood decorate the room around her, her expression cycling between love and accusation. "This is what you did to me," she said as Mark's cardiovascular system continued its spectacular failure. "Prolonged my agony because you couldn't handle your own pain. Now you get to experience what it feels like to die slowly while someone you love watches helplessly." Mark's femoral artery opened up, sending a fountain of blood toward the ceiling that splattered back down like crimson rain. Each vein rupturing in perfect sequence to maximize the visual impact of his death. "Please," Mark managed to gasp as his blood pressure plummeted. "Mom, please forgive me." "Forgiveness doesn't stop the bleeding, Marky," Rebecca replied sadly. "Just like love didn't stop the cancer." Mark's carotid artery was the last to go, sending a final geyser of blood across the room before his heart finally ran out of fluid to pump. He collapsed to the hospital floor, his body drained of the life force that had sustained him for 17 years. But even as he died, he could hear his mother calling to him from her hospital bed. "Join me, Marky," she whispered, her voice growing fainter as his consciousness faded. "Stop the suffering for both of us. Let us be together in the dark where there's no more pain." The burn thing stood over Mark's drained corpse, shaking its head with mock sympathy. "Another tragic case of a young man who couldn't cope with loss," it announced to the empty ICU. "Death by pharmaceutical misadventure, complicated by unresolved maternal attachment disorder." Mark's vision faded to black, but not before he saw his mother's face one last time, not accusatory now, but infinitely sad, as if she understood that his death wouldn't bring her peace any more than her life had brought him happiness. Robert Stevens found his son's body at 7:15 a.m. when he went to Mark's room to borrow $20 for groceries. The boy was slumped against the bedroom wall, a needle still protruding from his left arm, surrounded by drug paraphernalia and empty pill bottles. The coroner would determine that Mark had died from blood loss caused by multiple vascular ruptures, a side effect of the massive cocktail of drugs he'd injected into his system. The official report would note that such catastrophic circulatory failure was extremely rare in overdose cases, usually occurring only when victims mixed incompatible substances in fatal proportions. What the report wouldn't mention was the way Mark's blood had sprayed across his bedroom walls in patterns that looked almost intentional, artistic arrangements that seemed to tell a different story. His father would find the photograph of Rebecca on Mark's nightstand, now splattered with his son's blood but somehow still intact. In the picture, she was smiling, but Robert could swear that her expression had changed, that she looked sadder now, as if she understood that death had claimed both her and her son, and that neither of them had found the peace they'd been seeking.